All of America was drinking to She's Actin' Single. Through Gary Stewart's raw voice, the working class heard their own exact despair. But behind the hits, the Nashville music machine was breaking him. To survive the grueling tours and corporate pressure, Stewart developed a severe cocaine addiction. The drug didn't numb the pain, it destroyed his mind and trapped him in a brutal depression. When his wife died, he lost his only reason to keep fighting. At 59 years old, Gary Stewart committed suicide with a single gunshot to the neck. This is the brutal reality of how cocaine and Nashville pressure led to the king of honky-tonk suicide. Born on May 28, 1944, in Letcher County, Kentucky, Stewart entered a world defined by physical labor and economic hardship. Letcher County was deep coal mining territory, an environment where the primary export was natural resources and the primary reality was physical exhaustion. When Stewart was 12, his father, a coal miner who had suffered a devastating injury in the mines, relocated the family to Fort Pierce, Florida. This was not a move to the glamorous, tourist-driven coastlines marketed in post-war brochures. The Stewart family moved to the agricultural and industrial interior of the state, an area dominated by citrus groves, cattle ranches, and assembly lines. The geographic shift merely traded the subterranean darkness of the Kentucky coal mines for the suffocating, humid labor of working-class Florida. In this environment, music was not an extracurricular pursuit. It was one of the few viable methods of psychological escape and potentially economic elevation. Stewart was exposed to the collision of sounds that defined the Southern working class in the 1950s. The high, lonesome sound of Appalachian bluegrass his family brought from Kentucky, the rhythm and blues radiating from local radio stations, and the aggressive early tremors of rockabilly. He taught himself to play the guitar and the piano. He did not learn in acoustically treated rooms. He learned by ear, mimicking the records he heard, developing a heavy percussive piano style that compensated for the lack of formal instruction. By his mid-teens, Stewart was already integrated into the adult world of survival. The concept of adolescence was a luxury his socioeconomic bracket could not afford. At the age of 17 in 1961, he married Mary Lou Taylor. This union, formed before either had reached legal adulthood, was the defining structural element of Stewart's life. For the next 4 decades, through industry exiles, chemical collapses, and personal tragedies, Mary Lou was the sole stabilizing force in an otherwise chaotic trajectory. Their marriage was forged in immediate, uncompromising reality. Taking on the responsibilities of a husband, Stewart required a steady income. He secured a position at the Piper Aircraft Plant in nearby Vero Beach, Florida. This period is critical to understanding the authenticity of his later work. Stewart did not observe the working class, he was entrenched in it. During the day, he stood on an assembly line, engaged in the deafening, repetitive manual labor of manufacturing airplanes. It was a life dictated by the punch clock, the physical ache of standing on concrete floors, and the mental numbness of industrial repetition. He was an anonymous gear in a manufacturing machine, a reality that cultivated a deep-seated aversion to corporate control and repetitive conformity. When his shift at the aircraft plant ended, Stewart's second life began. To supplement his factory wages, he played the local honky-tonk circuit at night. The Florida roadhouses of the early 1960s were not polite venues. They were rough, volatile establishments populated by agricultural workers, laborers, and transient populations looking to aggressively burn off the frustrations of the work week. The atmosphere was dense with cheap beer, cigarette smoke, and the constant underlying threat of physical violence. Playing in these venues required more than musical proficiency. It required survival skills. In these roadhouses, the sound systems were primitive, often nothing more than a cheap microphone routed through a distorted amplifier. To cut through the ambient noise of 100 drunk shouting patrons, a singer had to project with maximum force. It was in this hostile acoustic environment that Stewart developed his signature vocal style. The aggressive, quivering vibrato that critics would later analyze as a stylistic choice was, in its origin, a functional necessity. He pushed his vocal cords to the absolute limit, straining to be heard over the din of the bar and his own heavy-handed piano playing. He learned to read a hostile room, understanding that if the music didn't hold the audience's attention, the evening could rapidly devolve into a brawl. He was performing not for applause, but for tips and the right to walk out of the venue unharmed. This punishing schedule, building aircraft by day and grinding out country and early rock sets by night, created a massive physical and psychological deficit, but it also forged a performer of terrifying intensity. Stewart's sets were chaotic, high-energy collisions of traditional country themes and Southern rock aggression. He was a local anomaly, a factory worker who possessed a volatile, undeniable stage presence. The collision course with the mainstream industry was initiated by a chance encounter. In the late 1960s, Mel Tillis, an established, highly successful country music star, happened to stop at a venue in Okeechobee, Florida, where Stewart was performing. Tillis, operating within the polished constraints of the Nashville system, immediately recognized the raw, unrefined power of Stewart's set. Tillis understood the mechanics of the music business. He recognized that Stewart possessed a functional talent that could be monetized, but he also knew that remaining in the Florida swamps would yield nothing but a lifetime of bar fights and factory wages. Tillis offered Stewart blunt, practical advice. If he wanted to survive in music, he had to leave the roadhouses and move to Nashville, Tennessee. It was not an invitation to stardom. It was a directive to enter the corporate headquarters of country music. For Stewart, the decision was a brutal calculation. He had a wife to support and was staring down a lifetime on the Piper aircraft assembly line. Nashville represented the only viable exit strategy. In 1968, packing whatever he and Mary Lou could fit into a car, Gary Stewart left the immediate physical labor of Florida to confront the sophisticated, psychological grinding of the Nashville music machine. He was walking directly into the epicenter of the industry, entirely unaware that the very establishment he hoped would save him would eventually demand the total surrender of his identity. When Gary Stewart drove into Nashville in 1968, he was not entering a sanctuary for artists. He was clocking into an industrial complex. The city marketed itself as Music City, but its operational reality was closer to Detroit's automotive sector. Music Row was a hyper-efficient, ruthlessly pragmatic assembly line designed to manufacture, package, and distribute intellectual property. The raw materials were rural archetypes and working-class heartbreak, which were quickly processed, stripped of any genuine threat or grit, and polished into consumer-friendly commodities. For a man who had spent his formative years bleeding over a guitar in hostile Florida roadhouses and driving rivets into Piper aircraft, the pristine corporate corridors of Nashville presented an entirely new psychological kind of warfare. He had escaped the physical toll of manual labor only to find himself in a system that demanded the complete subjugation of his artistic identity. The immediate friction between Stewart and the Nashville establishment stemmed directly from the dominant sonic architecture of the era. By the late 1960s, the country music industry was terrified of losing market share to the cultural dominance of rock and roll. The industry's defensive strategy was the complete homogenization of its sound. This era, dominated by the Nashville sound, was defined by the systematic removal of traditional country instrumentation. Fiddles and steel guitars, the acoustic markers of rural poverty and working-class bars, were replaced by sweeping orchestral string sections. Rough, idiosyncratic vocals were buried beneath layers of smooth choral backing groups. The producers on Music Row operated with a clinical precision, utilizing a closed network of elite session musicians known as the A-Team to ensure every record sounded uniformly safe, sophisticated, and devoid of regional friction. Into this sanitized, middle-of-the-road ecosystem walked Gary Stewart, a musician whose entire vocal and instrumental style was forged in environments where subtlety was a liability. His voice possessed a violent, quivering vibrato, a natural acoustic weapon developed to cut through the ambient noise of 100 drunk, shouting patrons in a Florida dive bar. He attacked the piano with a heavy percussive rhythm heavily influenced by Southern rock and rhythm and blues. To the executives on Music Row, Stewart was not a visionary. He was an acoustic defect. He was an unpolished anomaly that simply did not fit the highly calibrated machinery of their radio format. The system's initial attempt to process him was brief and entirely unsuccessful. Through his connections, Stewart managed to secure a minor recording contract with Cap Records, a subsidiary label that functioned as a low-risk testing ground. The resulting sessions were a masterclass in industrial mismatch. The studio producers, rigidly adhering to the Nashville formula, attempted to force Stewart's aggressive, chaotic energy into polite, mid-tempo arrangements. They tried to smooth out the jagged edges of his vibrato and restrain his heavy-handed piano playing. The records that emerged from these sessions were fundamentally compromised, sterile, confused, and entirely stripped of the danger that made him compelling in a live setting. Unsurprisingly, the singles failed to register on the charts. The market rejected the sanitized version of Gary Stewart, and Cap Records immediately severed the contract. By 1969, Stewart was officially deemed a commercial failure, a liability cast out of the recording studio, and relegated to the margins of the industry. However, Stewart possessed a pragmatic ruthlessness born of economic necessity. He was married, broke, and stranded in a city that had just rejected his voice. He could not afford the luxury of artistic martyrdom. If Nashville would not let him sing, he would sell them the raw materials they needed to keep their assembly lines running. He pivoted from performer to supplier, entering the grueling, anonymous world of Music Row publishing houses. Partnering with a local police officer and songwriter named Bill Eldridge, Stewart clocked into a small windowless office and began manufacturing songs for other artists. This was the intellectual equivalent of the Piper Aircraft Factory. The duo treated songwriting as a strict 9-to-5 manual labor job. They analyzed the current charts, identified the thematic formulas the major labels were buying, and churned out material tailored to the specific vocal ranges and public personas of established stars. For several years, Gary Stewart operated as a ghost in the Nashville machine. He channeled his authentic, lived experiences of poverty, barroom violence, and marital strain into lyrics, only to hand those lyrics over to millionaires who had not seen the inside of a real roadhouse in decades. It was an exercise in extreme psychological compartmentalization. He was generating the intellectual property that kept the industry profitable, yet he was denied the right to deliver his own truths. The strategy, however, was financially effective. Stewart and Eldridge secured cuts with major traditional country artists. They wrote "You Can't Housebreak a Tomcat" and "The Hard Times Will Be the Best Times" for Stonewall Jackson. They supplied reliable album tracks for chart toppers like Nat Stuckey, Billy Walker, and Cal Smith. Stewart was finally earning a steady paycheck, surviving in the system, but the cost was the total erasure of his public identity. He was watching lesser, more compliant talents build empires on the foundation of his intellectual labor. The catalyst that ultimately shattered this holding pattern did not originate in Nashville. It came from Detroit. In 1970, Berry Gordy's Motown Records, the undisputed titan of polished rhythm and blues, was engaged in a corporate expansion strategy. Motown recognized the immense untapped purchasing power of the white Southern working class and began laying the groundwork for a country music division. Motown did not understand the polite orchestral Nashville sound. Their entire corporate identity was built on deep grooves, rhythmic aggression, and vocal intensity. When Motown scouts came south looking for material to build their new catalog, they were not interested in the sanitized country pop ruling the airwaves. They were looking for something with a visceral, rhythmic pulse. Through his publishing connections, Stewart was hired by Motown simply to record demo tapes. The financial arrangement was insulting but standard for the era. He was paid a flat fee of $30 to sit in a room and commit his songs to tape. These were not intended for public release. They were utilitarian blueprints, skeletal recordings meant to be passed along to Motown's targeted artists. Because there were no A-team session musicians, no string sections, and no corporate producers hovering over the console dictating the arrangement, Stewart was completely unmonitored. For the first time since leaving the Florida roadhouses, he was allowed to sound like himself. Alone with a microphone, a guitar, and a piano, Stewart unleashed years of repressed industrial frustration. He hammered the keys, pushed his voice into that dangerous, ragged vibrato, and infused the country lyrics with the driving, heavy rhythm of Southern rock. He recorded songs about infidelity, alcohol addiction, and the absolute desperation of the working poor, and he delivered them without a shred of the polite melancholy Nashville preferred. These $30 tapes captured the exact, unvarnished reality of a man on the edge of a psychological cliff. Motown's country division ultimately floundered before it could properly launch, but those raw demo tapes became highly classified contraband within the underground industry. They circulated through back channels until they landed on the desk of a young, aggressive producer named Roy Dea. Dea was a rogue operator working within the corporate structure of Mercury Records, and he fundamentally understood the shifting socio-economic tides of the early 1970s. The post-war economic boom was ending. The Vietnam War had fractured the national psyche, inflation was destroying blue-collar wages, and the polished, escapist country music of the previous decade suddenly sounded profoundly tone-deaf to a massive demographic of angry, struggling Americans. When Dea listened to Stewart's Motown demos, he did not hear a flawed, unpolished singer. He heard the exact sound of the impending decade. He heard the genuine, terrifying anxiety of the American working class. Dea recognized that the Nashville sound was becoming a liability and that the market was primed for a violent correction. Shortly after hearing those tapes, Roy Dea was recruited to join the executive ranks of RCA Records, the largest and most powerful corporate label in the world. Dea accepted the position with a specific, calculated agenda. His first strategic maneuver inside the walls of the corporate behemoth was to locate the man who had recorded those $30 demos and initiate a hostile takeover of the country music charts. The machinery was about to invite the anomaly inside its own walls, entirely unaware of the destructive chain reaction it was triggering. Roy Dea's transition into the executive ranks of RCA Records in 1973 was the Trojan horse Gary Stewart needed to breach the walls of the Nashville establishment. Dea brought Stewart's $30 Motown demos directly to the top brass. The RCA executives were not music critics. They were actuaries. They listened to the tapes, analyzed the shifting demographics of a cynical post-Vietnam America, and calculated that there was a highly profitable, untapped market for this specific brand of working-class aggression. They offered Stewart a recording contract. To a man who had spent years feeding his best material to other singers while struggling to pay rent, the contract looked like salvation. In reality, it was a legal mechanism designed to extract his authenticity and then heavily regulate it. The initial phase of the RCA contract was highly deceptive because the label, unsure of how to process Stewart, temporarily allowed Roy Dea to dictate the production. The result was a direct, unfiltered transmission of Stewart's Florida Roadhouse years onto vinyl. In 1974, RCA released Drinkin' Thing. The track was a violent disruption of the country radio airwaves. It did not feature the sweeping strings or polite background choirs of the dominant Nashville sound. Instead, it was driven by an aggressive, heavy-handed piano, a distorted pedal steel guitar, and Stewart's terrifyingly desperate vocal vibrato. The song climbed into the top 10, proving Dea's thesis: the audience was starved for reality. In 1975, Stewart delivered the lethal blow with the album Out of Hand and its lead single, She's Actin Single. The track hit #1 on the Billboard country charts. The album itself became a critical monolith, universally recognized as one of the most important country records of the decade. It perfectly captured the blue-collar disillusionment of the 1970s. For a fleeting moment, Gary Stewart held the undisputed center of the country music universe. He was touring relentlessly, backed by his band, the Honky-Tonk Liberation Army, turning respectable concert halls into chaotic, smoke-filled dives. However, in the corporate architecture of a major record label, a #1 hit is not a license for artistic freedom. It is a trigger for immediate corporate intervention. Once Out of Hand proved that Gary Stewart was a high-yield asset, RCA's A and R department and marketing executives descended on him. They analyzed his chart success and identified what they considered a critical flaw. Stewart's audience was fiercely loyal, but it was restricted strictly to hardcore country and Southern rock demographics. To maximize their return on investment, RCA demanded crossover appeal. They wanted Stewart's music piped into mainstream pop radio stations, suburban supermarkets, and middle-class living rooms. The executives issued a directive to sanitize the product. The marching orders were explicitly clear: smooth out the rough edges. They instructed producers to bury the heavy bass and aggressive slide guitars under softer, more palatable arrangements. Most crucially, they targeted Stewart's voice. The very vibrato that made him famous was suddenly deemed too erratic for pop audiences. Engineers were instructed to pull his vocals back in the mix and surround him with generic harmonizing backing singers to cover up the raw desperation in his delivery. He was ordered to wear tailored suits instead of denim. RCA was attempting to retrofit a working-class rebel into a polite, middle-of-the-road pop star. For Stewart, this corporate interference was not just annoying. It was intellectually and musically repulsive. Archival interviews and accounts from session musicians of the era paint a picture of a man physically nauseated by the sterile environment of Nashville's elite studios. He viewed the A-Team session players, who could flawlessly read sheet music, but had never dodged a beer bottle in an Okeechobee dive bar, as highly paid mechanics, not musicians. The demand to tone down his performances felt like a directive to lie to the exact audience that had just put him on top of the charts. Stewart's response to this corporate suffocation was not a quiet resignation. It was an act of deliberate, career-ending industrial sabotage. As RCA tightened its grip on his studio sessions, Stewart weaponized his music against his own label. Instead of softening his sound to appease the pop markets, he leaned aggressively in the opposite direction, actively courting the heaviest, most unapologetic elements of Southern rock. He began associating with the outcasts of the rock world, completely ignoring Nashville's strict social hierarchies. This rebellion carried over into his 1980 album, Cactus and a Rose. Defying explicit label directives, Stewart invited members of the Allman Brothers Band, including Dickie Betts and Greg Allman, to play on the record. He brought rock and roll drummers into the pristine Nashville studios and instructed them to hit the kits with maximum force. He pushed his own piano playing to the brink of heavy metal. He was intentionally creating a record that the pop country crossover market would find unlistenable. The strategy was an artistic triumph, but a commercial suicide pact. Your Place or Mine is now considered a masterpiece of genre blending, but upon its release it triggered an immediate, systematic retaliation from the Nashville syndicate. Radio programmers, the gatekeepers of the era, took one listen to the aggressive rock instrumentation and pulled Stewart from their playlists. The feedback from the radio conglomerates was unanimous and fatal. Gary Stewart was suddenly too rock for country radio. Simultaneously, despite the presence of rock legends on the album, mainstream rock stations refused to play him because his quivering vocals and steel guitars made him too country for rock radio. By refusing to compromise, Stewart had engineered his own exile. He had successfully alienated the very demographic RCA was trying to capture, and in doing so, he gave the label the justification they needed to execute a professional execution. Recognizing that Stewart was fundamentally unmanageable and mathematically incapable of crossing over into the pop charts, RCA executives quietly but ruthlessly cut his lifelines. They slashed his promotional budgets. They stopped funding his tour support. They ceased pushing his singles to national radio syndicates. The descent was swift and clinical. Within 2 years of standing at the absolute summit of the country music industry, Gary Stewart was effective. Blacklisted by the machine that built him. He was still technically under contract, but he was treated as dead weight. The label shifted their massive financial resources toward compliant, easily packaged artists who were willing to sing whatever was placed in front of them. Stewart was left stranded in a musical no man's land, holding on to his artistic integrity while his career was methodically starved to death. The psychological toll of this massive systemic rejection would soon require a chemical solution, pushing Stewart toward the darkest and most destructive phase of his existence. The transition from a major label priority to an industry liability did not happen overnight. It was a grueling, protracted war of attrition. By the late 1970s, RCA had systematically dismantled Gary Stewart's promotional infrastructure. The marketing budgets were zeroed out, radio pluggers were reassigned to compliant pop country artists, and the massive financial apparatus that sustains a national touring act evaporated. Stewart was left with the legal shell of a recording contract and the brutal economic reality of a working-class musician. He had a band to pay, a family to support, and a lifestyle that required a constant influx of cash. With record royalties plummeting due to the label's deliberate embargo on his promotion, the only remaining mechanism for generating revenue was the road. Touring without the logistical and financial safety net of a major label is not a glamorous pursuit. It is an endurance test. Stewart was forced to abandon the controlled environments of theaters and arenas, regressing back to the chaotic, grueling circuit of southern honky-tonks, roadhouses, and secondary market clubs. This was the exact environment he had desperately tried to escape a decade earlier. He and the Honky-Tonk Liberation Army were traversing thousands of miles across the American South and Midwest in a cramped, deteriorating tour bus. The schedule was relentless, often requiring them to play 5 to 6 nights a week, sometimes executing multiple sets per night, merely to break even on fuel, equipment maintenance, and personnel costs. To survive this physical and logistical punishment, Stewart required a mechanism to artificially sustain his energy. Alcohol had always been the socially acceptable, easily accessible lubricant of the country music industry. It was built into the culture, celebrated in the lyrics, and provided free in every dressing room. Stewart drank heavily to numb the psychological humiliation of his industry exile and the physical ache of the road. However, alcohol is a depressant. It degrades motor skills and induces fatigue. To counteract the paralyzing effects of severe alcohol abuse and the chronic exhaustion of playing 250 dates a year, Stewart integrated a highly functional, highly destructive chemical into his daily operation: cocaine. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, cocaine was not viewed by the music industry merely as a recreational narcotic. It was treated as a performance-enhancing utility. It was the standard currency of musicians forced to operate beyond the limits of human endurance. For Stewart, cocaine served a very specific utilitarian purpose. It acted as an artificial ignition system. It allowed him to consume massive quantities of alcohol without passing out. It masked the severe vocal strain caused by pushing his signature vibrato through inadequate club sound systems night after night. It provided the hyper-focused, kinetic aggression required to dominate a hostile, intoxicated crowd at 2 a.m. But the biological reality of cocaine and alcohol dependency is mathematical and unforgiving. When cocaine and ethanol are metabolized simultaneously by the liver, they form a highly toxic compound called cocaethylene. This compound has a significantly longer half-life than cocaine alone, and it is exponentially more cardiotoxic. Stewart was systematically poisoning his own cardiovascular and central nervous systems. The chemical combination severely disrupts dopamine receptors and serotonin production, permanently altering the brain's chemical architecture. The objective medical consequences began to manifest in his professional output and personal behavior. The physical degradation was apparent. The artist who had once possessed a terrifying, commanding stage presence became erratic and physically unpredictable. Concert promoters reported missed sound checks, drastically shortened sets, and performances where Stewart appeared completely disconnected from the band, his timing destroyed by chemical interference. The aggression that once defined his music mutated into intense clinical paranoia. He isolated himself from the few remaining industry allies he possessed. He viewed the RCA executives not just as corporate adversaries, but through the distorted lens of stimulant-induced psychosis, believing there were active, coordinated conspiracies to destroy his life. It is crucial to examine this descent with objective accountability. The Nashville corporate system was unequivocally exploitative. They utilized his raw talent to generate millions of dollars, attempted to sterilize his identity, and ruthlessly discarded him when he refused to conform. The system created the hostile environment. However, the decision to self-medicate, to ingest toxic volumes of narcotics, and to prioritize chemical dependency over professional discipline was entirely Stewart's own. He was a victim of corporate mechanics, but he was the primary architect of his physical ruin. The choices he made in the back of that tour bus permanently compromised his ability to fight back against the label. RCA, observing this rapid deterioration, saw an opportunity to finally cleanly sever the relationship. They forced Stewart to fulfill his contractual obligations under increasingly impossible conditions. In 1980, they released the album Cactus and a Rose. In a desperate bid to reclaim the Southern rock audience, Stewart collaborated closely with Greg Allman. The record was heavy, blues-driven, and musically uncompromising. It was also completely ignored by country radio, exactly as RCA anticipated. In 1982, the label paired him with Dean Dillon for the album Brotherly Love. The record barely registered on the charts. Having mathematically proven that Stewart was no longer a commercially viable asset, RCA Records officially terminated his contract. At 38 years old, Gary Stewart was dropped, indebted, and heavily addicted. He entered the 1980s not as the reigning king of Honky-Tonk, but as an independent contractor operating in a severely reduced capacity. The mainstream country industry underwent a massive aesthetic shift during this decade, embracing the highly polished, synthesizer-heavy urban cowboy movement. Stewart's raw, bleeding aesthetic was completely obsolete in this new, sanitized market. He spent the majority of the decade in a professional wasteland, relying on the fierce loyalty of a shrinking hardcore fan base in Texas and the Deep South to generate enough ticket sales to fund his addictions. He recorded sporadically for independent labels, but the sessions were often derailed by his unreliability and rapidly declining health. The chemical abuse was methodically destroying his body, but it was a catastrophic external trauma that ultimately shattered his mind. In the late 1980s, Gary Stewart's son, Gary Joseph Stewart, committed suicide. The death of his son cannot be analyzed as a mere biographical footnote. It was the definitive psychological breaking point of Stewart's life. The grief was immediate, absolute, and insurmountable. When a parent experiences the suicide of a child, the resulting psychological trauma frequently manifests as severe, treatment-resistant major depressive disorder, compounded by intense paralyzing guilt. For a man already battling severe substance dependency and the neurological damage caused by years of cocaine toxicity, this trauma was fatal to his functional capacity. Stewart completely withdrew from the public eye. The touring stopped. The sporadic recording sessions ceased. He sequestered himself in his home in Florida, retreating entirely into isolation. The defense mechanisms he had spent his life building, the aggressive music, the chemical numbness, the relentless touring, were entirely useless against the reality of his son's death. He was no longer fighting the Nashville machine. He was fighting a daily, brutal war against his own consciousness. The decade that had begun with his exile from the corporate music industry ended with his total exile from society. He was a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered on Music Row about the dangers of refusing to play the game, while the man himself sat in Florida, entirely consumed by a grief that no chemical could erase. No human mind or body could withstand the simultaneous impact of severe chemical damage, complete professional exile, and the unnatural trauma of a child's suicide. In the aftermath of his son's death in the late 1980s, Gary Stewart did not experience a poetic period of mourning. He underwent a total physiological and psychological shutdown. The music industry, operating with its usual ruthless efficiency, had already moved on. Nashville was in the midst of the neo-traditionalist movement, championing clean-cut, highly manageable artists like Randy Travis and George Strait. Stewart's brand of volatile, chemically fueled honky-tonk was no longer just commercially unviable. It was considered an embarrassing relic of a chaotic era the corporate executives were desperate to forget. He was completely erased from the industry narrative. During this prolonged period of exile in his Fort Pierce, Florida home, a fierce historical debate emerges regarding the exact nature of Stewart's incapacitation. While the devastating effects of his cocaine and alcohol abuse are undeniable, the underlying psychological architecture remains contested. Some sources and medical professionals, observing the patterns of his behavior, claim that Stewart suffered from severe, undiagnosed clinical depression or bipolar disorder long before he ever signed a recording contract. Under this framework, his entire career, the aggressive stage persona, the relentless touring, and the heavy substance abuse was a prolonged exercise in self-medication. The honky-tonk lifestyle, which normalizes and even rewards heavy drinking and erratic behavior, provided the perfect, socially acceptable camouflage for a man battling profound neurochemical imbalances. The industry did not cause his illness, but it weaponized it for profit, stripped away his coping mechanisms, and then abandoned him when the symptoms became visually unmarketable. Regardless of the root cause, the daily reality of Stewart's life in the mid to late 1980s was a grim, repetitive cycle of withdrawal maintenance and profound isolation. The fortune he had generated for RCA during the 1970s was gone, entirely consumed by terrible contracts, canceled tours, and the exorbitant cost of maintaining a heavy narcotic dependency. The man who had once commanded arenas and earned the public reverence of Bob Dylan was now a ghost in his own house. He stopped writing. He stopped playing the piano. His vocal cords, previously strained by years of aggressive performance, began to atrophy from disuse. The sole structural support preventing Stewart's complete physical obliteration during this dark decade was his wife, Mary Lou. Their relationship is the most critical, least understood variable in his survival. This was not a sanitized, romanticized music industry marriage. It was a brutal, pragmatic trench war. Mary Lou had been with him since he was a 17-year-old factory worker. She had managed the meager finances during the lean years, navigated the terrifying chaos of his peak fame, and was now tasked with keeping a deeply traumatized Addie E-Ted man alive in a state of professional ruin. The accountability here is complex. Stewart's choices forced Mary Lou into an agonizing role of perpetual crisis management. Yet without her constant, unyielding presence, the medical reality is that Stewart would not have survived the 1980s. She maintained the perimeter of their lives, ensuring the bills were somehow paid and shielding him from the absolute worst consequences of his total collapse. Then, an anomaly occurred. In 1988, the machinery of the music business unexpectedly reached back into the Florida swamps. High-Tone Records, an independent label based in California specializing in roots rock and traditional country, approached Stewart. Unlike the corporate actuaries at RCA, the founders of High-Tone were genuine fans of his unfiltered 1970s output. They recognized that while mainstream country radio had abandoned him, there was still a fierce localized market for his specific brand of trauma. They offered him a modest, strictly controlled recording contract. It was not a ticket back to superstardom. It was a pragmatic business arrangement aimed at a niche demographic. Stewart accepted, and the resulting album, Brand New, stands as a stark forensic audio document of a survivor. The recording sessions were difficult. Stewart was fragile, and the physical toll of the preceding years was immediately evident in his voice. The soaring, aggressive vibrato of the 1970s had been violently filed down by chemicals and grief. His vocal range had narrowed, and the tone was noticeably darker, more ragged, and deeply scarred. Yet this physical degradation inadvertently added a terrifying layer of authenticity to the music. When he sang about regret, addiction, and ruined lives, it was no longer a performance. It was a sworn testimony. Brand New was critically well received by independent reviewers who praised its unvarnished honesty, but its commercial impact was practically non-existent on a national scale. However, the album served a vital utilitarian function. It provided Stewart with the necessary leverage to return to the road. Realizing that Nashville would never welcome him back, Stewart completely bypassed the traditional industry infrastructure. He focused his entire operation on Texas and the Deep South. Entering the 1990s, Gary Stewart found a massive, fiercely loyal cult following in the sprawling, beer-soaked dance halls of Texas. Venues like Billy Bob's Texas in Fort Worth became his new headquarters. The Texas audience, inherently suspicious of Nashville's polished pop country, embraced Stewart as a returning battle-scarred outlaw. These were not the glamorous, high-paying arena tours of his youth. This was grueling, blue-collar labor. He was a man in his 50s, carrying severe neurological and physical damage, loading his own gear, and playing extended sets in smoke-filled rooms until 2 a.m. He was functional again, but the baseline had permanently shifted. He still utilized alcohol to manage the physical pain of performing and the lingering psychological horrors, but the catastrophic chemical spirals of the early 80s were largely kept at bay by the necessity of survival and Mary Lou's vigilant presence. He released a string of albums for High Tone throughout the 90s. Battleground, I'm a Texan, each one a reliable, hard-hitting collection of honky-tonk survival anthems. He was making a living on his own terms, completely divorced from the corporate machine that had tried to sanitize him. He had fought the industry to a bloody draw. He was no longer a superstar, but he remained unequivocally Gary Stewart. Yet this fragile equilibrium, built entirely on the foundation of his marriage and his grueling Texas touring schedule, was a house of cards. The final decade of his life was underway, and the system had one last devastating variable to introduce. The fragile, functioning architecture of Gary Stewart's survival in the late 1990s and early 2000s was entirely reliant on a single load-bearing pillar, Mary Lou Taylor. The absolute finality of his end becomes entirely clear when we strip away the romanticized notions of the musician's muse. Mary Lou was not a passive observer of his genius. She was the operational manager of his physical reality. For nearly 43 years, she had absorbed the collateral damage of his wars with the Nashville corporate machine, managed the financial ruins of his catastrophic 1980s chemical dependencies, and organized the logistics of his grueling independent Texas touring circuits. She was the barrier between Stewart and total institutional or biological collapse. When a human being spends 4 decades outsourcing their baseline executive functions and emotional regulation to a single partner, the sudden removal of that partner does not result in a period of mourning. It results in an immediate catastrophic, systemic failure. By the fall of 2003, Stewart was 59 years old. His body carried the irreversible, invisible scars of chronic cocaethylene toxicity, thousands of nights of sleep deprivation, and the baseline physical erosion of a man who had been playing roadhouses since he was a teenager. Yet he was still operating. He was booked. He had a highly anticipated show scheduled for late November at Billy Bob's Texas, the massive Fort Worth venue that had served as his sanctuary when the mainstream industry blacklisted him. The engine was still running, but the chassis was fundamentally compromised. The mechanism of his final destruction was not a dramatic corporate betrayal, a sudden drug overdose, or a violent barroom confrontation. It was a standard clinical biological failure. In November 2003, Mary Lou contracted pneumonia. In a healthy younger demographic, pneumonia is a manageable respiratory infection. In a woman in her late 50s, compounded by the chronic invisible stress of managing a severely traumatized and historically addicted spouse, it escalated with lethal velocity. The medical reality of her decline stripped Stewart of his final remaining defense mechanisms. He had spent his entire life using music and narcotics to outrun his circumstances. There is no chord progression and no chemical compound that can reverse acute respiratory failure. On November 26, 2003, Mary Lou Taylor Stewart died. Gary Stewart's final 20 days were marked by a quiet, absolute surrender. The moment Mary Lou's death was pronounced, the tether snapping was audible to anyone who knew him. He did not issue a public statement. He did not attempt to process the grief through songwriting. His immediate action was purely functional. He canceled the scheduled performance at Billy Bob's Texas and terminated all future touring obligations. This was not a temporary hiatus. It was a permanent cessation of operations. The man who had played through chemical psychosis, industry exile, and the suicide of his own son simply shut the machinery down. There was no longer a logistical reason to continue generating revenue, and there was no longer a psychological reason to remain in the physical world. He retreated into his home in Fort Pierce, Florida, the same house where he had isolated himself during the darkest periods of his 1980s exile. Friends, remaining family members, and the tight-knit network of Texas musicians who revered him attempted to breach the perimeter. They understood the lethal mathematics of the situation. They knew they were watching a man who possessed a history of severe clinical depression and a lethal familiarity with firearms, sitting alone in an empty house. Welfare checks were made. Phone calls went unanswered. The isolation he engineered in those final weeks was deliberate, calculated, and impenetrable. He was not behaving like a man looking for a lifeline. He was behaving like a man putting his affairs in order before a scheduled departure. The conclusion arrived with brutal clinical precision. There was no prolonged hospital vigil, no final concert, and no melodramatic farewell letter released to the press. On December 16, 2003, exactly 20 days after the death of his wife, the physical reality of Gary Stewart came to an end. The forensic facts of the scene offer no room for romantic interpretation. His body was discovered by his daughter's husband and a friend who had gone to the Fort Pierce residence after failing to establish contact. At 59 years old, Gary Stewart was found dead of a single self-inflicted gunshot wound to the neck. The specific anatomical targeting of the wound, the neck rather than the temple or the chest, is a brutally efficient absolute method of terminating the central nervous system. It was not a cry for help or a botched attempt. It was a decisive, irreversible execution of his own existence. The immediate aftermath of his death triggered one of the most cynical and predictable mechanisms of the American music industry: the immediate corporate monetization of a tragic narrative. Within hours of the police reports being filed in Florida, the very establishment that had systematically starved Stewart of promotional funding, buried his master tapes, and driven him into the grueling secondary markets, began drafting public eulogies. Nashville executives who had deemed him a commercial liability in the late 1970s suddenly issued statements to the press praising his uncompromising genius and his authentic outlaw spirit. This is the ultimate hypocritical calculus of the corporate music machine. A living rebel is a logistical nightmare. They demand creative control. They argue with producers, and they alienate target demographics. A dead rebel, however, is a highly profitable, risk-free intellectual property. Once Stewart was safely in the ground, incapable of fighting back or demanding royalties for new output, the industry went to work. Labels immediately began auditing his back catalog. Compilations were packaged and rushed to production. The very albums RCA had once considered too abrasive for the market were suddenly marketed as essential historical documents of the outlaw country movement. Independent labels capitalized on the tragedy by pushing his live recordings. A concert recorded earlier that year at Billy Bob's, Texas, was aggressively marketed, transformed from a standard live album into a morbid historical artifact, the final audio transmission of a doomed genius. The industry effectively sanitized his suicide, repackaging the clinical reality of his profound depression, chemical damage, and paralyzing grief into a marketable aesthetic of honky-tonk heartbreak. They sold the tragedy back to the very working-class audience Stewart had spent his life representing, generating revenue that the man himself had been denied in his final decades. To analyze Gary Stewart's legacy through the lens of mainstream country music history is to look at a deliberately distorted mirror. the industry prefers to frame his story as a cautionary tale of excess, a brilliant flame that burned out too quickly due to the standard rock and roll vices. That narrative is a comfortable, profitable lie. It removes the accountability from the corporate structure that utilized him as a raw material. The factual reality of Gary Stewart is far more abrasive. He was a generational talent who possessed a voice that acted as a direct, unshielded conduit for working-class anxiety. He entered a corporate system that demanded he amputate his identity in exchange for commercial viability. He refused. He engaged in a decades-long war of attrition against record executives, radio programmers, and the sanitized expectations of the Nashville elite. He fought this war using the only weapons available to him: uncompromised music, relentless touring, and eventually a catastrophic regimen of chemical self-destruction. He was not a flawless martyr. He was fully accountable for the narcotics he ingested, the physical damage he inflicted upon his own nervous system, and the heavy collateral toll his lifestyle exacted on his wife. But his poor choices do not negate the objective reality of his exploitation. He was a man chewed up by an industrial machine that profits from authenticity but refuses to tolerate the messy, often destructive reality of the authentic human being. Gary Ronnie Stewart's life was a brutal transaction. He purchased his artistic freedom at the absolute highest possible margin. He paid for it with his physical health, his financial stability, his psychological baseline, and ultimately his life. His legacy is not just a collection of perfectly executed country songs. It is a harsh, unyielding reminder of the devastating personal cost a man pays when he refuses to become a corporate product.